This program was made possible by the law firm of Zalman and Schnorman, whose practice is limited to personal injury and insurance law. Welcome to Lawline with your host, Alan Schnorman. Mr. Schnorman is a distinguished trial attorney, author, and lecturer. Each week, Lawline will bring you the most knowledgeable experts in the field of law today. And now, we introduce our guests and our host, Alan Schnorman.
Welcome to Lawline. In the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing, the fear of domestic terrorism has resulted in a sense of deep anxiety for many Americans. In response to these concerns, new counterterrorism legislation is being proposed that erodes some of the constitutional rights that have shaped our society. Today we'll examine this very important issue with our guests, Nadine Straussen, President of the American Civil Liberties Union and a professor of law at New York Law School, and Mike Burns, Chairman of the New York County Conservative Party. Hello, Nadine. Hello, Mike. What's happening in Washington? What's this legislation, and what effect is it going to have?
The legislation is very frightening, Al, and interestingly enough, it was introduced by the Clinton administration even before the the tragedy in Oklahoma.
Interesting.
Yes, and at that time it was called officially the Omnibus Counterterrorism Act. The American Civil Liberties Union has argued, I think correctly, that a more accurate name for the legislation is the Ominous Counter-Constitution Act. Nobody is in favor of terrorism. However, many law enforcement authorities agree that we already have our government officials, the FBI, the ATF, other law enforcement arms already have enough power to suppress terrorism and to prosecute it after it occurs. The World Trade Center bombing in New York City is a very good example. Under existing law, there was a very prompt arrest and ultimately prosecutions and convictions for a very long period of time. Now, there are so many constitutional dangers and dangers to civil liberties through the Counterterrorism Act that I hardly know where to begin. But if I were to pick the basic flaw, it is that the whole law operates on a notion of guilt by association. It seeks to allow the government to punish, and in the case of non-citizens, to deport people merely on the basis of their affiliation with organizations or groups, some other members of which might have been engaging in illegal activity.
Without due process or with due process?
Without due process. In fact, one of the worst aspects of this bill is it creates a star chamber type proceeding. Non-citizens, even if they're lawfully resident here for many years, can be deported based on summary hearings based on completely secret evidence. The evidence need not be disclosed to those individuals or to their lawyers.
It's not subject to cross-examination?
No, it's a reinstitution of the Star Chamber. And interestingly enough, many conservatives in Congress have been speaking out against this as a violation of the most cherished and fundamental due process rights, the right to know the evidence against you.
Michael, what's the position of the Conservative Party?
The Conservative Party thinks that the proposal by the Clinton administration is totally useless. It goes against everything we stand for many of the same reasons. We feel that the problem has been that there are laws on the books, but unfortunately they're not enforced to the extent they could be. And part of that, we feel, is the responsibility of the ACLU, because they have had a tendency over the years to demand that the law be enforced with 100% perfection. For example, searching for evidence. If it's not done 100% perfectly correct, whatever evidence there is and whatever follows up as a result of that should be thrown out, so that if policemen, in an honest attempt to defuse a situation or an attempt to go into some of these terrorist cells, find information, the ACLU is the first one out there saying, wait a minute, hold it, Constitution, you didn't do this exactly by the book. So there is a certain frustration over the failure of the government having the means by which to investigate some of these organizations. They are there. It's just a matter of the judicial interpretations and some of the defense of the ACLU, which kind of weaken existing laws.
How do you feel about that?
I don't think we should blame the ACLU. We didn't exist in 1791 when the Fourth Amendment was added to the Constitution that said that the government may not conduct searches and seizures except based on probable cause. And in fact, over the protests of the ACLU, the FBI during the 1980s adopted guidelines that go far below that standard, that constitutional standard of probable cause. The FBI is now, and has been for more than 10 years, allowed to infiltrate and to monitor and to conduct surveillance and other investigation based merely on, quote, a reasonable indication, close quote, that some criminal activity or violent activity is being planned.
But I think that's a definition of reasonable. I mean, we're looking at the situation now with ACT UP, who is saying, why is the FBI investigating us? Well, for a certain amount of time, ACT UP and some of the affiliated organizations were threatening acts of violence. And I think, therefore, the FBI certainly has the right, by the standards of the Conservative Party, to look into those activities and see if, in fact, there's any validity to them and whether or not any kind of preemptive action should be taken. The ACLU feels, well, that's the wrong way to do it. Our feeling, again, is that there are enough laws on the books at the current time to protect the public. In most of these cases, I think Oklahoma, there is no law that could have prevented it, none at all. And I think that anyone who feels that any kind of anti-terrorism legislation would prevent an Oklahoma situation from happening doesn't understand what did.
Isn't the president saying that if we had this type of legislation, we can go into these groups, the militias, and actually do those things with this legislation that we cannot do under existing law?
And it wouldn't have prevented
and that the America would be a safer place?
No, and it would not have prevented what had occurred there, because the militia had taken these people and asked them to leave. And I can tell you that a lot of these so-called right-wing groups that are espoused as being dangerous and so forth, and I know some people in them, the most extreme spokesmen are usually asked to leave those organizations. And I think the kind of laws that Clinton is looking for will not work whatsoever, and will have absolutely no impact at all in protecting the public.
Well, I agree with that. And actually, experts who have studied militia movements for years have said that FBI infiltration is not an effective prosecutorial technique anyway, because most members of those organizations do not espouse any kind of violence at all, let alone participate in it. That it is, in fact, only very fringe elements, some fringe cells, who are never going to be found out by any surveillance technique anyway.
250 million Americans are watching the television, watching these militias training with assault weapons in some cases, and their spokesmen get on TV and they said, yes, we are here training to protect the Constitution against our own government. Now, what does that mean?
It means that there are people who fear that the government of the United States has taken certain legal positions vis-a-vis environment issues in particular, which we feel takes away our private property, our rights of private ownership, and some of the taxes and the way that they are investigated by the IRS take away private property without due means. Due process.
Why the assault weapons? Why not put it in the voting box? Why the assault weapons?
Because ultimately it has been proven time and time again that, and it says in the Second Amendment, when the people are armed, they have the ability to defend themselves against the government. And unfortunately, in this country, if you take a look at some of the legislation that's been passed over the years, the legislation does not represent all of the people all of the time.
Well, I have to say I disagree with Mike's interpretation of the Second Amendment, but that's really beside the point, because what most of these folks are exercising is their First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and one of the aftermaths...
That's the Second Amendment is the right to bear arms.
One of the aftermaths, including the right to advocate a view of the Second Amendment, which is not necessarily accepted by other people, including the Supreme Court. One of the outfalls of recent events is that people are being criticized and assumed to be dangerous merely because they make very strong statements criticizing the federal government and abuse of federal law enforcement authority. And to me, in a democracy with supposed freedom of speech, the most important speech is the right to criticize the government.
What I don't understand, and perhaps you can explain it to me, is I see a difference between somebody espousing a political point of view and saying that the government is not adhering to the Constitution and doing whatever they want and trying to put their people in a politically sensitive position to for their views, and another point of view where they actually are dealing with assault weapons and training, saying that we're going to protect the Constitution at all costs.
Now, they have a
But
legal right to do that.
They have a legal right to bear
And,
arms.
we can disagree about whether it's constitutionally justified, but it's certainly not illegal to own guns in
What
this
you're
country.
saying
But
is
they're
if I'm
training. What are they
espousing
training for, Michael?
how to use weapons correctly, and as a matter of fact,
Against whom?
against whomever should attack them.
Who's going to attack them?
I don't
They're
think
talking about the
anybody...
government. They're saying, are they saying that the Washington government is going to come down to them and they're protecting themselves and the Michigan militia is
Well,
protecting
what
themselves?
happens if someone owns a piece of property, large farmland, it rains on it a couple months a year, the land gets wet, the government comes in and says, we have decided that is federally protected wetland and you no longer can use it or have access to it, and the government will use whatever means we have at our hand to take that land and protect that land from your using it. The farmer goes out, he's going to go out with six tractors, the federal government shows up with 40 armed marshals. Don't you think the government then is taking by force with weapons?
Do you feel under those circumstances, the militia, whether it's the Michigan militia or any of the other militias, the thousands of militias around the country, the participants, then have a right to surround the tractors with assault weapons and say, government, you stand by and you're not coming into this farm?
I think if that can hold off the government long enough for them to then seek redress in the courts, absolutely.
Hold off? How do you feel about that?
Well, the point is that it is not illegal under current law for these people to own those weapons, and none of the legislation that's being proposed would make it illegal. So in some ways, we're mixing apples and oranges. You are objecting to the lack of gun control measures in this country, which is a completely separate issue, and one that I think might more rationally make a contribution to dealing with problems of crime and violence and potential terrorism in this country. But that's not what the legislation is about. The legislation is about giving the FBI even more power than it already has to infiltrate organizations, to take away people's rights and freedom, and even to deport them merely because they happen to be associated with groups. Now, let me tell you,
But
specifically,
there's a difference between infiltration, number one, and number two, the right to find people guilty by association.
Under this law, the president has unreviewable power to label any organization a terrorist organization. It is not subject to judicial
That's
review.
right. And that's a difference between the, quote, infiltration aspect of it and the right that, for example, if someone from England comes over here and wants to participate in the Conservative Party, while he cannot enroll in the party because he's not a U.S. citizen and a registered voter, and he advocates major changes in the government, let's get rid of Clinton, let's get rid of all these people in Congress, they're a disgrace, they're an outrage, they're violating the Constitution.
Let's change our immigration policies, as some recent
the
immigrant
President
from
of the
England
United
argued.
States can say that English friends of the Conservative Party are a danger to America, and I want them all put on the next plane out.
He could say that about the whole Conservative Party, and he could say that about the American Civil Liberties Union. We're
At least
already
me, he couldn't
suspect.
put on a
Under
plane.
the proposed legislation,
Yes.
should it be enacted,
Yes.
then the
And there's
president and the executive would have the
Just
authority.
Just the president would
And
have the
no
authority.
judicial review could label any organization a terrorist organization. And once that's true, any non-citizen who has given any support to that organization, including supporting a completely lawful aspect of their activities, can be summarily
But
deported.
aren't we in...
And a citizen, by the way, can be prosecuted and punished, even for...
Nadine, you're president of the American Civil Liberties
You
Union.
bet.
And I understand it's the tenet of the Civil Liberties Union to protect the Constitution and everybody's rights under the Bill of Rights. But aren't we in a terrorist atmosphere where buildings in Oklahoma are bombed out, where right here the World Trade Center is brought to a close and people are
But you're
killed?
dealing with-
Isn't this,
but you're dealing
aren't
with
we
different
under
kinds
almost
of
a
people.
siege mentality today when you go onto the subway and you never know what to expect? In Japan, where one group literally kills people and injures 5,000?
But
And
the
it's
American
exactly-
public has regularly said, and there was just a poll done by U.S. News and World Report, where as a matter of fact, since the bombing in Oklahoma, more people would prefer liberty over security than they did before the bombing. The point is that
Liberty over security or security over liberty?
liberty
Sounds
over
like an ACLU
security.
member.
Liberty over security. The point is that the people in Oklahoma were completely different from the actions and activities that took place in New York City with the World Trade Center, number one. Number two, gun control would have nothing to do with that because guns were not used. The point is that you will always have a small group of people who want to take some kind of violent action, And while there are some kind of steps that you can take to prevent it, you will never be able to prevent it and have anything even closely resembling
We have to take a break now, but we'll continue right after this moment. You're watching Lawline. I'm Alan Schnorman, your host. Stay with us. Hello, I'm Alan Schnorman, the host of Lawline, and I want to give you some important information about your legal rights. If you were seriously injured in an automobile, a fall down, or construction accident, you may be entitled to a substantial money award for your pain and suffering. It is important to speak to a knowledgeable attorney in that field. At my firm, Solomon & Schnorman, our practice is limited to personal injury law. We fight for the rights of accident victims. Don't try to evaluate the case yourself. If you have any questions about your accident, call us at 1-800-LAWLINE. If you're too injured to come to our office, we will come to you. The consultation is free, and we only get paid when your case is settled or won. Remember, the insurance companies have lawyers protecting their interests, and so should you. Hello, you're watching Lawline. I'm Alan Schnorman, your host. We're discussing the proposed legislation now with having to do with terrorism in the United States and what the president wants to do as far as more security. And of course, we have a different point of view right here. We have Nadine Straussen, president of the American Civil Liberties Union, and Mike Burns, chairperson of the New York County Conservative Party. Nadine, you wanted to say right before the break?
I certainly did. You had asked, aren't we in an unusually dangerous time now? Isn't it necessary to impose particularly stringent measures? And my answer to that is no, Alan. From the time that the Bill of Rights was adopted, this country has periodically experienced bouts of hysteria over actual or perceived threats to national security. And every single time, the first impulse is to cut back on people's civil liberties. And it turns out in historical retrospect that not only were those measures terrible in terms of depriving people of basic rights, the essence of being an American in my view, but also did nothing to foster national security. To take one very dramatic example that recently everybody has recognized was wrong was the internment of 110,000 Japanese Americans after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That was classic guilt by association. Of course, our country felt under siege. It was the first time there had been that kind of attack on American shores, and in retrospect, that did not do any good for national security.
I can appreciate that. The only difference that I'd like to discuss, if I may, is that I watch television and I see the thousands of militias around the country
But they have been there
training.
for years, and what you are seeing now is perception. What you are seeing is television making that one image available to the world. And whether there were 50 people doing it 50 years ago and there was no TV covering it, or there's 50 people now and it's on every TV station, the picture of that young baby being brought out that
Yes,
died.
of course.
But that picture was seen all over the world over and over again. And what we're looking at is the media, who has, in our mind, its own agenda.
I understand that.
Taking that one small image and playing it over and over and over again. If we did not have the kind of cable TV and the TV equipment that we have now, with microwave and with satellites, with the ability to have 50 TV stations live 24 hours a day at Oklahoma City, I can assure you that a great deal of the hysteria and the emotion generated by that would not have existed 30 years ago. And I think that that is being used by the president in particular to try and generate his desire to get new kinds of laws.
When remember, his proposal, it was introduced before Oklahoma City. I want to remind you of that. It was introduced in February, and it was going nowhere at that
Certainly, it
point.
might have anticipated events, because
scary.
certainly what happened.
There is nothing in his proposal that could have prevented what happened in Oklahoma City. Absolutely nothing. Some of the proposals that have been made by conservatives over the years vis-a-vis the issue of immigration could have prevented what happened at the World Trade Center. We feel strongly the immigration laws must be tightened up.
How would you tighten them?
How would we tighten up? Number one, we would change the way by which some of these people get visas who come into this country and over again.
Well, they don't get visas. Many people just come into Kennedy Airport
Number one. Number two is
and
there's
say,
been-
ask for asylum.
Yes, but virtually
20,000.
anyone can get a visa who wants to come into this country. They just go from office to office because the bureaucracy of the State Department is so badly organized. that if you get turned down at one department of one office of the Department of State, you can go to another one, and eventually you'll find one that will give you a visa to come here, number one. Number two, I think this question of people coming to this country demanding asylum, and many of them being let out and being called back for future hearings. I think until someone has been granted asylum, they should be not allowed outside of, what do you want to call them, concentration camps, prisons, holding facilities, or whatever. But I think the fact that these people are allowed into this country automatically on the grounds.
How do you feel about that?
Well,
Adrian?
I'm astounded. I mean, since when is somebody who's been granted a political asylum, or even on a temporary basis, been responsible for any kind of terrorist act? I mean, talk about guilt by association.
But there is a lot of guilt by association, because some of them come here for the purposes of raising money. They are the quote, the political arm, the education arm of these entities. If you take a look at the IRA raises millions of dollars a year in this country, a great deal of which is taken back to England specifically for terrorist purposes.
Well, if you intend to aid a terrorist activity, then that is legitimately punishable as a crime. But if you intend to aid a humanitarian effort that's undertaken by an organization, that should not be a crime. That should be completely lawful.
It's totally humanitarian, of which 40% of the money after it leaves here is used for terrorist activities, whether it be in the Middle East.
And we're not necessarily talking about immigrants. Americans have given money to humanitarian efforts that have been carried out by the IRA, by the PLO, by the African National Congress. Let's not forget that used to be a terrorist organization.
But if you can take some of that and eliminate some of that with stricter immigration controls, and the issue of immigration covers a lot of other areas, but particularly in this area, anyone who claims that they need political asylum is allowed into this country, is granted temporary asylum until such time as the hearings are done.
Unfortunately, that's not true. I think it should be under international law, but
Mike,
it's not.
Something that I'd like you to answer for me,
Yes.
if you can. Normally, the Conservative Party is for law enforcement. Normally, this has been my view, normally a Conservative Party wants more government in the activities of the people, yet you're now...
I don't think
absolutely
that's a
not.
conservative idea.
No, absolutely not. The Conservative Party believes in less government is the best government.
What about the law enforcement?
Law enforcement believes that the government has responsibilities that are not available in the private sector. However, there's a limit to how much power we want to give to the government vis-a-vis security. We feel that we as citizens also have not only the right, but the responsibility to participate in part of the enforcement of law by our ability to keep our eye on our neighbors, see who's across the street.
Enforcement of law, yet earlier on the show you said that you believe that a militia had the right to surround tractors if the government was taking land. And you believe that the militia had a right to surround those tractors when
Not
40
a militia,
marshals...
per se, citizens.
With
people.
guns, with arms...
Well, if they didn't have arms, then the police who had arms would come in and arrest everybody. And I think that very often the federal government on a lot of these issues acts very arbitrarily by the overwhelming amount of the money it has for lawyers and the ability to basically browbeat the public on many of these issues.
Well, it is true that there have been many abuses of authority by federal law enforcement officials. Back last year, the ACLU and the National Rifle Association and a host of organizations issued a joint statement condemning abuses of power and brutality by the ATF and other federal
Such as
law
what?
enforcement
Are we
officials.
talking about Waco?
Well, we're talking about Waco, we're talking about Idaho, we're talking about many other specific incidents. And just as
What
the
happened in
ACLU,
Idaho?
the Randy Weaver
Right.
situation where his wife and his
killed.
child were
And if they did
gunned
not
down.
have, if they did not have the kind of arms that they had, and again, I think it's an extremely unfortunate incident. It's not something that we recommend that everyone do, but here was a case where the government went after these people with such an overwhelming armament as to create an unfortunate situation.
And we're not suggesting that, the ACLU is not suggesting that the appropriate response is to arm the citizenry, but to disarm and to control abuses of power, to subject them to
If
civilian review.
President Clinton was out there watching, what would you say to him?
What would I say to him? I'd say, why don't you get busy solving the economy, solving our international affairs, and if you want to talk so tough, then you do it in places like Eastern Europe.
Well, what about the government? What about the terrorism, the government, the militias, and his positions on that?
I think he's taking positions only because he's trying to do something to get public support for what he's doing, which is being probably one of the worst presidents we've had in this century. And I think that he should spend more time on working on the economy, working on a realistic solution to the Medicaid and Medicare problems, realistic solutions to welfare, and sitting down with the Contract for America and taking a real good, hard look at that, because that's what the American public voted for.
And Nadine, what would you say to
I'd
President
say
Clinton?
don't scapegoat civil liberties. Please remember what Thomas Jefferson said more than 200 years ago. Any society that would trade a little liberty for a little security will deserve neither and lose both.
But of course, he is saying right now, we need this legislation
We don't
in order,
need it. And
in order
interestingly
to
enough-
protect
As the
ourselves.
And
of the
interestingly
United
enough,
States.
many law enforcement officials, including in the ATF and the FBI, have said they don't need any more power. They've said they need more resources. They need more personnel.
This
and
is
that's
an
a totally
emotional
separate
issue that I think President Clinton has wrapped himself in, because he said just a few weeks ago, I am relevant. Well, he's looking for something to prove it, and I think that this is a phony issue. And again, I go back to the fact, we have serious economic problems in this country. We have serious problems with the way government is run. The Contract for America is an indication the American people want change on these issues that have been subject of discussion for years, and it's time that he should start spending time on that and not look
Mike,
for emotional issues.
comment on this. The head of the Michigan militia said that he and his group believes that right now the government in Washington is part of a conspiracy with the United Nations for a one world concept. That they're going to have one
There is
world,
legislation.
one government, and that he's protecting the United States Constitution against the United Nations and this one world concept. How do you feel about that?
I think there's a certain degree of legitimacy what he says. When the United States has signed, and there has been in Congress discussion of putting American troops under the command of the UN military and UN leadership of people who are not Americans, when they talk about joint commands and joint controls, and they have the GATT and the NAFTA agreements, which allow questions of duty to be determined at an international level, which may be contrary to U.S. law. I have serious problems about a one world government, and I see that certain legislation has been proposed or supported, which in fact does that, and takes away our rights as American citizens and denigrates them to the lower level of what exists in most of the other parts of the world.
And I say, whether he's right or wrong, he has a right to say it. And the United States Supreme Court has said you even have the right to advocate the overthrow of the United States government. It's constitutionally protected.
Lady, let's make believe we're in your living room now, and we're having a cup of coffee. And I'm going to ask you to take off your hat as president of the American Civil Liberties Union.
You'll still find a civil libertarian here. I'm sorry.
And we're watching television, and we're seeing the militias training, and we're listening to them, and they're saying they're training against the United States government, which they sincerely believe is not enforcing the Constitution, and you get the impression that they're taking up arms against the government.
Yeah.
How do you feel about
Well,
that?
to me, the issue is the arms. I support gun control. And I oppose people being armed, whether they're armed as militias, whether they've got a pistol in their own bedroom. That is what I oppose, and I think that's the danger. The fact that these people also have ideas that the government is too powerful or they dislike what the government is doing, that to me is a separate matter.
You
That
see,
is
I
protected
question
by the
this-
First
Quickly?
Amendment.
You had the Black Panthers 10 or 15 years ago committing
Quickly,
acts
Michael?
of violence in the Weathermen. Where was the ACLU arguing the same issue? Where was the government at that time?
The ACLU does not support gun control. He asked me to take off my ACLU hat.
Michael Burns, thank you very much for being on Lawline. You're the county leader of the Conservative Party of New York County. Nadine Straussen, president of the American Civil Liberties Union. Thank you again for appearing on Lawline. And as always, this is Alan Schnorman, and thank you for watching Lawline.
You have been watching Lawline with your host, New York trial attorney Alan Schnorman. Mr. Schnorman will be back with you next week at the same time. If you have any questions about this week's program, please write to Lawline, 63 Wall Street, New York, New York, 10005, or call area code 212-432-9111. This program was made possible by the law firm of Zalman and Schnorman, whose practice is limited to personal injury and insurance law.